At my husband's funeral, a woman in black approached me and said, "Excuse me, but you're in the wrong place. I'm Robert's wife." She gestured to two children clinging to her dress. "These are his real children, and this is his real family. You need to leave." The funeral director nodded apologetically and escorted me to the back row like I was a distant acquaintance. What she didn't know was that I'd been documenting Robert's lies for months, and I had enough evidence to destroy the life she thought she was inheriting.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
I should have known something was wrong when Robert insisted on such a small, private funeral. "Just close family," he'd said in his final weeks as the cancer consumed him. "I don't want a big fuss, Emma. You know I've always been a private person." But standing in that funeral home in downtown Portland, watching a woman who looked exactly like me claim my husband's casket, I realized Robert's definition of close family had been very different from mine. My name is Emma Sinclair, and until 3 days ago, I thought I'd been married to Robert Mitchell for 15 years. I thought we'd built a beautiful life together in our Victorian house in the Hawthorne district. I thought the weekend trips he took for his consulting work were exactly what he claimed them to be. I thought the separate phone he carried was purely for business clients who needed to reach him after hours. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The woman standing beside Robert's casket was maybe 35, with auburn hair styled in a way that was both elegant and practical. She wore a black dress that looked expensive but understated, the kind of outfit that said she had money but didn't need to show it off. Her children, a boy who looked about 10 and a girl maybe 8, had Robert's distinctive green eyes and the same stubborn cowlick he'd always fought with in the mornings. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I think there's been some mistake. I'm Emma, Robert's wife." The woman's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been pity. "No, honey. I'm Christine Parker, and I've been married to Bobby for 12 years. These are our children, Matthew and Sophie." She gestured to the kids, who were staring at me with curious, innocent eyes. "Who did you say you were?" The funeral director, a nervous man with sweating palms, stepped between us. "Ladies, perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office?" But Christine shook her head. "There's nothing to discuss. This woman is obviously confused, or maybe she's one of Bobby's clients who became attached. You know how some people misinterpret professional relationships." The dismissal in her voice was gentle but absolute. She wasn't being cruel. She genuinely believed I was some delusional woman who'd misunderstood her relationship with her husband. The real tragedy was that part of me was starting to wonder if she might be right. Except for the ring. I looked down at the simple platinum band on my left hand, the one Robert had slipped on my finger in a small ceremony at the courthouse 15 years ago. The inscription inside read, "Forever yours, R." I'd never taken it off, not once in all those years. Christine was wearing an identical ring. "Your ring," I said, pointing with a trembling finger. She glanced down, then back up at me with growing concern. "Yes, my wedding ring. Bobby gave it to me when we got married. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down?" The funeral director was making increasingly desperate gestures to his assistants. Other mourners were starting to stare, whispering among themselves about the strange confrontation happening beside the casket. Robert lay there in his best suit, looking peaceful and entirely unaware that his two lives were colliding in the most spectacular way possible. "I need to see some identification," I said, my voice growing stronger. "Marriage certificate, something that proves what you're claiming." Christine's expression hardened slightly. "I don't need to prove anything to a stranger. This is my husband's funeral, and you're disrupting our grief. Security." But I was already pulling out my own marriage certificate from my purse. I'd brought it because Robert had specifically requested that certain legal documents be available in case there were any questions about beneficiaries or arrangements. At the time, I thought he was just being his usual meticulous self. Now I realized he'd been preparing for exactly this moment. Christine stared at the document, her face going pale. The date showed a ceremony that had taken place 3 years before her own marriage to Robert. The signature was unmistakably his, in the careful handwriting I'd watched him use to sign birthday cards and mortgage papers for over a decade. "This can't be right," she whispered. "Bobby would never. We have children together. We have a house, a life. He coaches Matthew's Little League team. He helps Sophie with her homework every night when he's home." When he's home. The phrase hit me like a physical blow because I suddenly understood Robert's schedule with perfect clarity. The consulting trips that took him away for 3 or 4 days at a time. The business meetings that required him to stay overnight in Seattle. The weekend conferences that always seemed to happen during school events or family gatherings. Robert hadn't been traveling for work. He'd been commuting between 2 families. "The house in Selwood," I said quietly. "Does he have a workshop in the basement? Tools organized by size? Everything labeled in that obsessive way he has?" Christine's eyes widened. "How did you know about his workshop?" "Because he built an identical one in our basement in Hawthorne. Same tools, same organization system, same workbench he special ordered from that company in Vermont." We stared at each other across Robert's casket, 2 women slowly realizing we'd been living parallel lives with the same man. Christine's children were getting restless, tugging at her dress and asking why Mommy was talking to the strange lady. Other mourners were openly staring now, sensing drama but not understanding its scope. "Ladies," the funeral director said urgently, "I really think we should discuss this privately." But Christine was already pulling out her phone, scrolling through photos with shaking hands. She turned the screen toward me, showing picture after picture of Robert at birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. Robert pushing a swing at a playground. Robert carving a turkey at what looked like Thanksgiving dinner. Robert in a hospital room, holding a tiny baby who must have been Sophie. In every photo, he looked exactly like the man I'd married. The same smile, the same way of tilting his head when he was genuinely happy, the same hands I'd held every night before we went to sleep. "This is Bobby," Christine said, her voice breaking. "This is my husband, the father of my children. He's been sick for 8 months, fighting cancer. We've been at his bedside every day, taking turns so someone was always there with him. 8 months. The same amount of time Robert had been receiving treatment at the cancer center downtown. The same treatments I'd driven him to 3 times a week. The same chemotherapy sessions where I'd held his hand and brought him books to read during the long hours of infusion. He'd been getting double treatments, telling each of us about the other set of appointments, using our love and concern to justify the additional time away from home. Even his cancer had become part of the deception. "I don't understand," Christine whispered, sinking into one of the chairs reserved for family. Her children immediately crowded around her, sensing their mother's distress without understanding its cause. "How is this possible? How is this possible? How could he do this to us?" But I was beginning to understand something Christine didn't yet realize. Robert hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been preparing for this moment, planning for what would happen when his 2 worlds inevitably collided. The separate bank accounts he'd mentioned in passing, the life insurance policies he'd been so careful to update, the will he'd insisted on revising just weeks before his death. Robert had orchestrated all of this, and standing there beside his casket, I was starting to realize why. He hadn't just been deceiving us about his dual existence. He'd been positioning one of us to inherit everything while leaving the other with nothing. The question was, which one of us was about to discover they'd been the real wife, and which one was about to learn they'd been living a lie? What Christine didn't know, as she sat there crying over the man she thought had been her devoted husband, was that I'd spent the last 3 months following Robert's every move. I'd hired a private investigator. I'd documented bank transfers and tracked phone records and photographed meetings she thought were private. I knew about the house in Selwood, about the children's college funds, about the secret safe hidden behind the false wall in what she thought was her husband's private study. She thought she was the grieving widow who deserved sympathy and inheritance. She had no idea she was about to meet the woman who held all the cards. The funeral home's private office felt like a confessional, all bark wood paneling and soft lighting designed to comfort the grieving.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Christine sat across from me with her children flanking her like bodyguards, their small hands clutched in hers. The funeral director had retreated after providing tissues and water, leaving us to untangle 15 years of deception. "Tell me about your life with him," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "From the beginning." Christine's grip tightened on her daughter's hand. "We met at a coffee shop in Selwood 12 years ago. I was working as a pediatric nurse, pulling double shifts to pay off student loans. Bobby was this charming guy who always ordered the same thing, black coffee and a blueberry scone, and sat at the corner table working on his laptop." The description hit me like cold water. Robert had told me almost the identical story about meeting a client at that same coffee shop, how it had become his favorite place to work when he needed to concentrate on complicated projects. "He was so persistent," Christine continued, a sad smile crossing her face. "Every day for 3 weeks, he'd try to start conversations. Finally, I agreed to have dinner with him, just to get him to stop asking." She glanced down at Matthew, who was quietly playing with a toy car. 6 months later, we were married. It was a small ceremony. Bobby said he didn't have much family, that he preferred intimate gatherings. The timeline was staggering. Robert and I had been married for 3 years when he began courting Christine. Our marriage had been stable, happy even. We'd been talking about starting a family, looking at houses with better school districts. I thought the only thing missing from our life was children. Now I realized that while I was dreaming about having Robert's babies, he was already raising them with another woman. "What did he tell you about his work?" I asked. "He was an independent business consultant," Christine said, "helped small companies with their financial systems and growth strategies. It required a lot of travel, Seattle, Vancouver, sometimes down to California. He'd be gone 3 or 4 days at a time, but he always called every night to talk to the kids." Those calls, I remembered them now. Robert stepping onto the back porch for client conversations that seemed unusually personal. The way he'd lower his voice and sometimes laugh at things that didn't sound business-related. He told me he was building rapport with demanding clients, that some of his contracts required him to be available for their family emergencies. "He was a good father," Christine said, and I could hear the fierce protectiveness in her voice. "When he was home, he was completely present. Soccer games, school plays, helping with homework, Matthew's science fair projects, Sophie's dance recitals. He never missed the important stuff." The important stuff. I thought about all the times Robert had missed events that were important to me. Gallery openings for my photography work, dinner parties with friends, anniversary celebrations that got postponed because of client emergencies. He'd always made it up to me later, with thoughtful gestures and sincere apologies, but now I understood why his business seemed to demand so much of his attention. He wasn't missing my events because of work. He was missing them because they conflicted with his other family's milestones. "Did he ever mention anyone named Emma?" I asked. "Maybe a colleague or business partner?" Christine shook her head. "Bobby was pretty private about his work relationships. He said mixing business and personal life was a recipe for complications." She paused, studying my face. "Did he ever talk about me? About the kids?" The honest answer was no, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Robert had been meticulous about compartmentalizing his 2 lives. He'd never slipped up with names or stories, never mentioned Christine or the kids, even in passing. Looking back, I was struck by how carefully he'd constructed his conversations, always steering away from topics that might create overlap between his worlds. "He was very private," I said instead, which was true enough. "Tell me about your marriage," Christine said. How long did you think you were married to him?" 15 years, I said, the number feeling surreal now. "We had a small ceremony too. Robert said the same thing about not having much family." I pulled out my phone and showed her pictures of our wedding day. Robert in the same navy suit he'd probably worn to marry her 3 years later. The same nervous smile, the same way of adjusting his tie when he was anxious. Christine stared at the photos with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. He looks exactly the same. Even his expressions, the way he's standing, it's like he was following a script. That was exactly what it was like. Robert hadn't just been living parallel lives, he'd been performing the same role in two different theaters. The devoted husband, the caring partner, the man who remembered to bring flowers on random Tuesdays, and always knew exactly what to say when work was stressful. "What about children?" Christine asked, quietly. "Did you and Bobby ever try to have kids?" The question landed like a physical blow. "We tried for years," I said, my voice barely audible. "Multiple fertility treatments, specialists, procedures. Robert was always so supportive, so patient. He said it didn't matter if we couldn't have biological children, that we'd find other ways to build our family." Christine's face went white. "Oh my God, he already had children. While you were going through fertility treatments, he was at home with Matthew and Sophie every other week." The cruel mathematics of it was staggering. All those years of hoping, praying, spending our savings on treatments that felt like long shots. The monthly disappointments, the gradual acceptance that parenthood might not be in our future. Robert holding me while I cried, reassuring me that our love was enough, that we didn't need children to have a complete life. He'd been lying in my arms, comforting me about our inability to have the family I desperately wanted, while his actual children slept in bedrooms 20 minutes across town. "I need some air," I said, standing abruptly. The funeral home's recycled atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the scent of lilies and the weight of revelation. Christine nodded, gathering her children. "We should probably get back to the service anyway. People will be wondering where we went." But as we walked back toward the main chapel, I found myself thinking about timing. Robert's cancer diagnosis 8 months ago had coincided with several changes in his behavior that I'd attributed to illness and fear. He'd become more secretive about his phone, more careful about his calendar, more insistent that I not accompany him to certain medical appointments. He'd also started asking questions about my work, my friends, my financial situation, casual inquiries that felt like someone was taking inventory of my resources and connections. At the time, I thought he was worried about how I'd manage if his treatment didn't work. Now I wondered if he'd been calculating something else entirely. "Christine," I said as we reached the chapel doors, "after Robert dies, what happens to your house, your children's college funds? Did he leave instructions about how you should handle his business clients?" She looked surprised by the questions. "Bobby took care of everything. He always said I shouldn't worry about financial details, that he'd make sure Matthew, Sophie, and I would be provided for." Her voice took on a note of pride. "He was very thorough about planning for the future." Very thorough, indeed. Robert had spent months setting up the perfect scenario for this moment. 2 grieving widows, each convinced of their legitimacy, each expecting to inherit the life they thought they'd build with him. But only one of us was going to discover that Robert's final deception was the cruelest one yet. The memorial service proceeded like a carefully orchestrated performance, with Christine and me sitting on opposite sides of the chapel like warring factions at a wedding. I watched her children fidget in their pews, saw the way other mourners approached her with condolences and casseroles, and began to understand the life Robert had built in Selwood. These people knew Christine as Bobby's devoted wife. They'd attended birthday parties at her house, cheered for Matthew at Little League games, watched Sophie perform in school plays. To them, I was the strange woman who'd caused that awkward scene earlier, possibly a confused business associate or distant relative who'd overstepped boundaries. But during the eulogies, I learned things about Robert that shattered my understanding of the man I'd married. "Bobby was the kind of father every kid dreams of having," said a man who introduced himself as Matthew's baseball coach. "Rain or shine, he never missed a game. Even when he was traveling for work, he'd drive back early just to watch Matt pitch, and he knew every player's name, every stat, every little victory that mattered to those kids." I remembered Robert's supposed business trips to Seattle, the ones that always seemed to end abruptly with urgent calls requiring his immediate return to Portland. Client crisis, he'd always said, looking genuinely frustrated about cutting his travels short. I hate leaving things unfinished, but some clients just can't handle problems without handholding. Now I understood those weren't client crises. They were soccer games and school concerts and parent-teacher conferences that mattered more to Robert than whatever excuse he'd given me. A woman who appeared to be Sophie's dance teacher spoke next. Bobby was so proud of Sophie's performances. He'd video every recital, sometimes from multiple angles, and he always brought the most beautiful bouquets. Sophie would light up whenever she spotted him in the audience. Those flowers. Robert had always been thoughtful about bringing me flowers, but they'd been random grocery store bouquets, pleasant afterthoughts picked up on the way home from work. The elaborate arrangements he'd been giving to his daughter required planning, special ordering, the kind of attention that spoke to genuine priority rather than convenient gestures. He was building something special for those kids, another friend added. The college funds, the trust accounts, that workshop in the basement where he was teaching Matthew woodworking. Bobby always said his children's future was his greatest investment. Children's future. The phrase hit me like cold water because Robert and I had never established college funds or trust accounts. We'd talked about saving for our hypothetical future children, but Robert had always said we should wait until we knew for certain whether we'd need them. No point in setting aside money we might not use, he'd reasoned. Let's focus on the present and see what the future brings. The future had brought Matthew and Sophie, two children who needed college funding while I'd been setting aside money for fertility treatments we'd never needed. Christine spoke last, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Bobby used to say that the measure of a man wasn't how much money he made or how successful he looked to strangers. He said it was how well he loved the people who depended on him, how completely he showed up for the moments that mattered. She described a man who coached weekend soccer games and attended every school play, who built elaborate Halloween costumes and remembered to pack special snacks for field trips, who read bedtime stories with different voices for every character and never seemed too tired for just one more chapter. This Bobby had been present, engaged, invested in ways that required sacrifice of time and energy. He'd carved pumpkins and assembled Christmas presents and taught his son to throw a curveball. He'd braided his daughter's hair and helped with homework and attended parent nights where teachers praised his involvement in his children's education. The Robert I'd known had been loving but distracted, always managing multiple priorities that kept him slightly removed from fully investing in our life together. He'd bring me flowers, but he'd never spent hours researching the perfect arrangement. He'd take me to dinner, but he'd never plan elaborate surprises that required weeks of coordination. He'd been affectionate and considerate, but never with the complete attention Christine was describing. I thought I was married to a caring but busy professional who was doing his best to balance work demands with personal relationships. Christine had been married to a man who treated family time as sacred, non-negotiable, worth any sacrifice or inconvenience. After the service, I followed the processional to Riverview Cemetery, staying back as Christine and her children watched Robert's casket being lowered into the ground. The headstone was already in place, engraved with Robert James Mitchell, beloved husband and father, 1975-2024. Beloved husband and father. The inscription made it clear which life Robert had considered his real one. But as I watched Christine throw dirt onto the casket while her children clung to her sides, I found myself thinking about financial logistics. Robert had been meticulous about money, always tracking expenses and investments with spreadsheet precision. During our marriage, he'd handled most of our financial planning, claiming he enjoyed the complexity of tax strategies and retirement calculations. "I want to make sure you're protected if anything happens to me," he'd said just months before his diagnosis. "Let me handle the boring financial stuff so you can focus on your photography." Robert had updated our will, adjusted our life insurance, and restructured our savings accounts. He'd also opened several new investment accounts that he'd described as diversifying our portfolio for better long-term returns. At the time, I'd been grateful for his financial expertise and attention to our security. Now I wondered what else he'd been diversifying. After most of the mourners had left, Christine approached me hesitantly. Her children were being watched by an elderly couple I assumed were her parents. I keep thinking there must be some explanation, she said. Some reason this makes sense. Bobby wasn't the kind of person who could live a lie for 15 years. 12 years, I corrected silently, but I understood her need to believe the man she'd loved was better than his actions suggested. Maybe we should go to his house, I suggested. Your house, I mean. Look through his papers together. Try to understand what he was thinking.
Christine nodded eagerly. Yes, that's a good idea. Maybe there's something that explains all this. Maybe he was protecting us from something, or trying to handle some complicated situation we don't understand. I agreed to follow her to Selwood, partly because I needed to see the life Robert had built there, but mostly because I was starting to suspect Christine was about to discover something that would destroy her understanding of who she'd been married to. The house in Selwood was everything Robert had claimed to want when we'd looked at properties together 15 years ago. Craftsman architecture with original hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, a kitchen that opened onto a backyard perfect for children. It was exactly the kind of family home he'd said was too expensive, too impractical for just the two of us. Too much house for our needs, he'd always said when I'd suggested similar properties. Let's find something more appropriate for our lifestyle. Our lifestyle, apparently, hadn't included children because Robert already had them here. Walking through Christine's house felt like touring an alternate version of my own life. The same furniture style Robert preferred, the same color palette he'd chosen for our home, even some of the same artwork hanging on the walls. But everything here was bigger, better, more carefully curated. The dining room table could seat 8 instead of 4. The living room had space for family gatherings instead of intimate conversations. The master bedroom connected to a nursery that had been converted into Sophie's craft room. This wasn't just Robert's second life. It was the upgraded version of the life he'd been living with me. Christine led me to Robert's study, a spacious room lined with built-in shelves and dominated by an antique oak desk that must have cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Filing cabinets stood at attention along one wall, each drawer labeled with Robert's obsessive organizational system. Bobby always said this was his sanctuary, Christine explained, running her fingers along the desk's polished surface. The kids weren't allowed in here without permission, and I only came in to dust or bring him coffee when he was working late. The room felt familiar yet wrong, like looking at a photograph that had been slightly altered. Robert's desk at our house in Hawthorne was smaller, more modest, pushed into a corner of our bedroom because we didn't have space for a dedicated office. But the organization was identical. Pens arranged by color, papers sorted into precise stacks, everything positioned at exact right angles. Did Robert ever mention feeling overwhelmed by his work? I asked, opening the first filing cabinet. Like he was juggling too many clients or commitments? Christine considered the question. Sometimes he'd come home looking exhausted, like he'd been solving everyone else's problems all day. But he never complained. Bobby always said that helping businesses grow was rewarding enough to make the stress worthwhile. The top drawer contained what appeared to be standard business files, client contracts, project timelines, expense reports. But as I flipped through them, inconsistencies began emerging. Invoice dates that overlapped in impossible ways, travel expenses for the same dates charged to different clients, mileage reports that suggested Robert had been driving between Seattle and Portland multiple times per week. Christine, look at this, I said, pulling out a folder labeled Walker Construction Services. The contract was dated 6 months ago, with project meetings scheduled every Tuesday and Thursday in Seattle. Did Robert work with this company? She nodded. That was one of his biggest clients. The meetings always ran late, so Bobby usually stayed overnight rather than making the drive back. He'd get home Wednesday evening or Friday morning, depending on how the sessions went. I pulled out another folder, Harrison Financial Consulting. This contract showed meetings every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, also in Seattle, with the same overnight arrangements. The timeline went rather it was supposedly in Seattle 5 days a week, working with 2 clients whose meeting schedules left no time for actual consultation work. Did he ever mention this Harrison company? I asked. Of course, that was his other major client. Between Walker Construction and Harrison Financial, Bobby was booked solid.
Sometimes I wished he didn't have to travel so much, but the money was good, and he said these big contracts would set us up for the future. The future, that word again. Robert had been constantly referencing the future, making promises about what their family would have once his business reached certain milestone. Meanwhile, he'd been telling me our financial situation was tight, that we needed to be careful about major purchases or investments. I opened a desk drawer and found something that made my stomach drop. Duplicate business cards. 2 sets of identical cards with Robert's name and contact information, but different addresses. One set listed a P.O. box in Southeast Portland, near our house. The other showed an address in Selwood, probably a mail service near Christine's home. He had 2 business addresses, I said, showing Christine the cards. She frowned. Bobby said having multiple locations made him seem more established to clients, like he had offices in different parts of the city instead of just working from home. That explanation might have made sense if Robert had actually been running a consulting business, but I was beginning to suspect that Walker Construction and Harrison Financial were as fictional as Robert's travel schedule. The real reason he needed 2 business addresses was to keep his mail separate, to ensure that bills and documents from each life didn't accidentally get delivered to the wrong house. In the bottom drawer, I found something even more disturbing: a second cell phone plugged into a discreet charging station hidden behind a stack of books. "Did you know about this phone?" I asked. Christine's expression grew troubled. Bobby said that was for emergency client contact only. He kept it turned off most of the time, but some of his contracts required him to be available 24/7 for urgent situations. I turned on the phone, and immediately it began buzzing with notifications. Text messages from Emma asking about dinner plans, doctor appointments, whether I wanted him to pick up groceries on his way home. Messages that had been sent during the past few weeks while Robert was supposedly focused entirely on his battle with cancer. The last message, sent 3 days ago, was from me. "How are you feeling after today's treatment? Should I make soup for dinner?" Christine stared at the screen, her face growing pale. "Those messages? They're from you?" Robert had been getting chemotherapy at 2 different treatment centers, I said, the pieces falling into place. He told each of us about the appointments at the other location. That's why his treatment schedule seemed so intensive, why he was always exhausted. He was actually receiving double the normal amount of care. But why would someone deliberately seek excessive medical treatment? The answer came to me with sickening clarity: documentation. Robert had been creating an extensive medical record, building evidence of a serious illness that would justify changes in his financial arrangements and estate planning. "Christine, when did Robert first tell you about the cancer diagnosis?" She thought for a moment. 8 months ago. He said he'd been having symptoms for a while, but hadn't wanted to worry me. When he finally went to the doctor, they found tumors in multiple locations. Her voice broke slightly. The oncologist said it was aggressive, that we needed to start treatment immediately if we wanted to have any chance. 8 months. The same timeline he'd given me, with the same urgency about beginning treatment. But if Robert had been receiving care from 2 different medical teams, his actual prognosis might have been very different from what either of us had been told. I opened Robert's laptop, grateful that he'd never been paranoid about password protection at home. His email accounts told a story that was becoming increasingly disturbing. Messages to both medical teams, coordinating treatment schedules to avoid conflicts, communications with life insurance companies, updating beneficiary information and increasing coverage amounts, correspondence with financial advisors about estate planning and asset protection strategies. Everything was dated from the same period, 8 months ago, when Robert's cancer diagnosis had supposedly forced him to confront his mortality and make arrangements for his family's security. "Emma, what exactly are you looking for?" Christine asked, watching me scroll through months of emails. "Evidence," I said simply. Robert spent years managing 2 separate lives, keeping every detail organized and preventing any overlap between his worlds. Someone that methodical doesn't leave things to chance when they know their deception is about to be exposed. I found what I was looking for in a folder marked estate planning, draft documents that had never been finalized, early versions of wills that showed Robert's thinking process. In the earliest drafts, dated 9 months ago, Robert had left everything to Christine and the children. His first instinct had been to protect his Selwood family, the life that included children and soccer games and school plays. But subsequent drafts told a different story. As Robert's illness progressed, the documents became more complex, with elaborate trust structures and conditional bequests. The final version, signed just weeks before his death, was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering that would require months to fully understand. What was clear, however, was that Robert had been planning this moment with the same attention to detail he'd brought to managing his double life. Every conversation about my work, every question about my financial situation, every suggestion about our future plans had been data collection for this final deception. Christine was reading over my shoulder, her confusion growing with each document. I don't understand most of this legal language, but it looks like Bobby was trying to protect both families. Isn't that a good thing? I wished I could share her optimism, but Robert's pattern was becoming clear. He'd spent months positioning one family to inherit everything while creating legal justification for leaving the other with nothing. The question was which family he'd chosen to protect and which one he'd decided to sacrifice. What I suspected, but hadn't yet found proof for, was that Robert's final act would be as calculated and cruel as everything else he'd done. He hadn't just been living two lives, he'd been conducting an extended experiment to determine which life deserved to survive his death. The evidence was all here in his study, hidden among the business files and family photos. I just needed to find the documents that would reveal which woman Robert had ultimately decided was his real wife, and which one he'd concluded was expendable. 3 months before Robert's death, I'd started noticing changes that I'd attributed to the stress of his cancer treatment. He'd become secretive about his medical appointments, insisting I didn't need to accompany him to every session. "The waiting rooms are depressing," he'd said. "Why don't you focus on your photography work instead? I'll be fine on my own." At the time, I thought he was being considerate, protecting me from the emotional drain of watching him suffer through chemotherapy. Now I understood he'd been protecting his scheduling system, ensuring I wouldn't accidentally discover he was receiving treatment on days when he was supposedly at Christine's house. But the real catalyst had been what happened on a rainy Tuesday in March, exactly 2 weeks before Robert's final hospitalization. I'd been scheduled to photograph a wedding that afternoon, but the bride had called to postpone due to a family emergency. Instead of spending the day at the venue in Beaverton, I found myself with unexpected free time. Robert had left that morning for what he'd called a crucial client meeting in Seattle, one that might require him to stay overnight depending on how negotiations progressed. On impulse, I decided to surprise him with lunch at his favorite restaurant downtown. It was the kind of spontaneous, romantic gesture that had characterized our early relationship, back when we'd both believed in the power of small surprises to strengthen our connection. I drove to Pioneer Courthouse Square, planning to call Robert and convince him to meet me before his afternoon meetings. The restaurant, a small Italian place called Marco's, was one of those hidden gems that locals protected fiercely from tourist invasion. Robert and I had discovered it during our second year of marriage, and it had become our traditional spot for celebrating business successes and anniversaries. But when I called Robert's phone, it went straight to voicemail. His business line did the same. Disappointed, but not particularly concerned, I decided to eat alone and maybe do some street photography while I was downtown. That's when I saw him. Robert was walking out of a building across the square, but he wasn't alone. A woman with auburn hair was beside him, and they were holding hands in the casual, unconscious way that spoke of long intimacy. Behind them, 2 children were playing some kind of game, racing each other to the fountain while the adults followed at a more measured pace. For a moment, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. The man looked like Robert from a distance, but surely when he turned around, I'd realize it was a stranger who happened to share my husband's build and gait. Then he laughed at something the woman said, and I heard the distinctive sound that had been making me smile for 15 years. Robert's laugh was unique, starting as a low chuckle and building to an almost musical quality that made other people want to join in. I'd heard it across crowded rooms at parties, recognized it in phone conversations from other rooms of our house. There was no mistaking that laugh. I watched, frozen in disbelief, as Robert helped the little girl tie her shoe while the boy showed him something he'd found near the fountain. The scene was devastatingly domestic, radiating the kind of comfortable family dynamics that develop over years of shared experiences. The woman, Christine, though I didn't know her name yet, was watching Robert interact with the children with an expression of pure contentment. This wasn't a new relationship or a casual affair. This was a family, complete and established and entirely separate from the life Robert shared with me. They walked toward a parking garage while I stood paralyzed beside the square's bronze statues, my camera hanging uselessly around my neck. I should have followed them. I should have confronted Robert immediately, demanded explanations, forced the truth into the open. Instead, I called in sick to my evening commitments and drove home to wait for Robert's return from his supposedly crucial business meeting in Seattle. He arrived at 8:30 that evening, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and full of apologies for not answering his phone earlier. "Client crisis," he said, kissing my forehead while setting containers of pad thai and green curry on our kitchen table. "The kind of day that makes you grateful for simple pleasures like coming home to someone who matters." Someone who matters. The phrase should have been romantic, but it felt calculated now, like Robert was testing words he'd used in other conversations with other people. "How was Seattle?" I asked, watching his face carefully. "Productive, but exhausting. The client finally signed the contract, but it took hours of negotiation to get there." He opened a beer and settled into his usual chair, displaying every sign of someone who'd spent a long day managing difficult professional relationships. Some days I think about early retirement, just walking away from all the business politics and traveling with you instead. The lie was delivered with perfect sincerity, complete with supporting details and future promises designed to make me feel valued and included in his long-term thinking. If I hadn't seen him with Christine and the children that afternoon, I would have believed every word. That night, lying beside Robert while he slept, I made a decision that would define the next 3 months of our marriage. Instead of confronting him directly, I was going to investigate systematically. I needed to understand the scope of his deception, the timeline of his double life, and most importantly, his intentions for resolving the situation. Part of my motivation was practical. If Robert was planning to leave me for his other family, I needed to protect myself, financially and legally. But mostly, I was driven by something deeper, the need to understand how someone could lie so completely for so long while maintaining the appearance of love and commitment. The next day, I hired Patricia Williams, a private investigator who specialized in matrimonial cases. Patricia was a former police detective in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd seen every variation of human deception. 15 years is a long time to maintain dual relationships. This isn't a typical affair situation. Your husband has been operating 2 complete lives, which requires extraordinary organizational skills and psychological compartmentalization. That suggests either sociopathic tendencies or someone who's been planning an exit strategy for a very long time. "What kind of exit strategy?" I asked. "That's what we need to determine. Some people maintain parallel relationships as insurance policies. If one situation falls apart, they have backup support. Others are testing which relationship provides better long-term benefits. And some are simply incapable of making choices, so they avoid deciding by keeping all options open indefinitely." Patricia's investigation over the following weeks revealed the stunning complexity of Robert's deception. Bank accounts I'd never heard of, credit cards funded by business expenses that didn't exist, insurance policies with beneficiaries that changed based on which office the paperwork was filed from. But the most disturbing discovery was Robert's pattern of increasing medical appointments and insurance claims. He wasn't just receiving duplicate treatment, he was building a comprehensive medical record that would support dramatic changes in his estate planning and financial arrangements. "Your husband is preparing for something," Patricia had told me during our final meeting, just days before Robert's hospitalization. "All this documentation, all these medical records, all the recent legal activity, it's like he's creating justification for decisions he's already made." "What kind of decisions?" The kind that would normally seem suspicious or unfair. If someone contests his will or questions his final arrangements, he's got months of medical records showing diminished capacity, urgent health crises, and legitimate reasons for making changes under pressure. Patricia handed me a thick folder containing 3 months of surveillance reports, financial analysis, and document authentication. Emma, I think your husband is planning to die soon, and he's been arranging for one family to inherit everything while leaving the other with legal justification for why they deserve nothing. Which family? I'd asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. That's the question you need to answer quickly, because based on his recent activity, I don't think you have much time left to protect yourself. She'd been right. Less than a week later, Robert was hospitalized with complications that would ultimately prove fatal. But by then, I'd already discovered the secret that would determine which widow would inherit his carefully constructed legacy and which one would be left with nothing but memories and debts. Sitting in Robert's study 3 days after his funeral, watching Christine search through filing cabinets with growing desperation, I realized she was beginning to understand that her husband's death had created more problems than solutions. Emma, I need to ask you something, Christine said, turning from a drawer full of insurance documents. What exactly did Bobby tell you about his financial arrangements? Did he ever mention trusts or investment accounts that were supposed to take care of you after he died? The question revealed more about Christine's situation than she probably intended. Robert had clearly made promises about her financial security, promises that were now proving more complicated than expected. He said he'd taken care of everything, I replied carefully, that I shouldn't worry about money or legal complications if something happened to him. What did he tell you? Christine's hands were shaking slightly as she pulled out a thick manila envelope marked Parker Family Trust, Final Documents. Bobby set up this elaborate trust structure last year. He said it would protect the house, the kids' college funds, everything we'd built together. But the lawyer's office called this morning, and apparently there are complications with the beneficiary designations. She spread the documents across Robert's desk, and I could see why the lawyer had called. The trust paperwork was a labyrinth of conditional clauses and cross-references that would require months to untangle. More importantly, several key pages were missing, leaving critical questions about asset distribution unresolved. Did the lawyer say what kind of complications? I asked. Something about conflicting claims from another beneficiary. They said someone else has been named as a primary heir in documents that predate the trust formation. Christine looked up at me with growing alarm. Emma, that couldn't be you, could it? I mean, I know you were married to Bobby, but the kids and I are his real family. Surely the law recognizes that biological children take precedence over a marriage that was obviously some kind of mistake or confusion. The dismissive way she said, obviously some kind of mistake, revealed something I'd been wondering about. Christine hadn't yet accepted that Robert's marriage to me was legitimate. In her mind, she was dealing with a delusional woman who'd somehow inserted herself into legal documents, not a legal spouse with equal claims to Robert's estate. Christine, my marriage to Robert was completely legitimate, I said. We have 15 years of tax returns, joint bank accounts, property deeds with both our names. Whatever Robert told you about his past, I wasn't a mistake or confusion. I was his wife. Her face hardened. His first wife, maybe, but Bobby and I have been together for 12 years. We have children together. We've been building a life while you were apparently living in some kind of fantasy about a relationship that ended years ago. The relationship didn't end, I said firmly. Robert was married to both of us simultaneously. He was commuting between 2 families, maintaining 2 households, living a completely double life. Christine stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked her backyard. That's impossible. I would have known. Bobby was here every other week, completely present, completely committed. He coached Matthew's baseball team, attended Sophie's dance recitals, helped with homework, planned family vacations. You can't fake that level of involvement.
But that was exactly what Robert had been faking. The complete presence Christine described was possible because Robert had dedicated specific days and weeks to each family, treating his dual life like a precisely managed business operation. When he was in Selwood, he could focus entirely on being Bobby the devoted father. When he was in Hawthorne, he could concentrate on being Robert the attentive husband. Did he ever travel for work? I asked. Business trips that took him away for several days at a time. Of course, but that's normal for his type of consulting. Seattle clients, Vancouver projects, sometimes week-long engagements in California. Christine's voice carried a defensive edge. Bobby worked hard to provide for his family. I never resented the travel because I knew he was building something for Matthew and Sophie's future. The travel schedule that had taken Robert away from Christine's house had been his time with me. The Seattle clients were our weekend trips to the coast. The Vancouver projects were our anniversary celebrations. The California engagements were our visits to my sister in San Francisco. Robert had used his supposed business success to justify his absence from each family while actually spending that time with the other one. Christine, I think we need to contact both of our lawyers, I said. This situation is more complicated than either of us realized, and we need professional advice about how to protect our interests. Her expression shifted to something colder, more calculating. Actually, I've already spoken with Bobby's attorney. Tom Richardson has been handling our family's legal affairs for years. He knows the children, understands Bobby's intentions, and he's confident that the trust structure will protect what Bobby wanted to preserve. Tom Richardson. The name was familiar because Robert had mentioned him occasionally, but always in passing, as someone who handled minor legal matters for his business clients. I'd never realized Robert had been using Richardson for significant estate planning. Did Richardson draft the trust documents? I asked. Of course, Bobby trusted him completely. Tom said that when there are competing claims on an estate, the court looks at which relationships were most significant to the deceased. Marriage certificates are just paperwork, but children represent a biological connection that can't be disputed. The legal theory Christine was describing wasn't entirely accurate, but it suggested that Richardson had been preparing her for a custody battle over Robert's estate. He'd been coaching her to view me as a minor impediment rather than an equal claimant, setting up a strategy that would position Christine and the children as the deserving heirs and me as an opportunistic outsider. Has Richardson seen our marriage certificate? I asked. Christine waved the question away dismissively. Tom said that document fraud is surprisingly common in estate cases. People forge papers, backdate relationships, even create fictional marriages to make claims on valuable estates. He said the court would need much more than a piece of paper to validate a supposed 15-year relationship that no one in Bobby's real life ever knew about. Document fraud. Richardson had been planting the idea that my marriage to Robert was illegitimate, preparing Christine to challenge not just my inheritance claims, but the very existence of our relationship. This wasn't just estate planning, it was character assassination designed to support Christine's position while destroying mine. Did Bobby ever mention having doubts about our marriage? Christine asked, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Maybe he felt guilty about leading you on, or worried that you'd misunderstood the nature of your relationship. Tom said that sometimes people in terminal illness situations attract obsessive attention from acquaintances who mistake professional courtesy for personal connection. The strategy was becoming clear. Richardson had been coaching Christine to reframe Robert's double life as a case of stalking or delusion on my part. In this version of events, I was an unstable woman who'd inserted myself into Robert's medical treatment, forged documents to support fictional claims, and was now trying to steal money that rightfully belonged to his children. It was a brilliant legal strategy, actually. Rather than trying to explain how Robert had managed to maintain two marriages simultaneously, Richardson was arguing that only one marriage had ever existed. Christine's family had documentation, witnesses, biological children, and a lawyer who specialized in protecting estates from fraudulent claims.
What Christine didn't realize was that Richardson's strategy required me to be either delusional or criminal. There was no middle ground in their version of events where I was simply another victim of Robert's deception. According to their narrative, I was the villain in a story where Christine and her children were the innocent targets of an elaborate con game. But I had something Richardson hadn't accounted for: Patricia Williams' investigation file, with 3 months of surveillance photos, financial records, and documented proof that Robert had been deliberately maintaining 2 separate lives. More importantly, I had evidence of Richardson's own involvement in structuring Robert's deception. Christine thought she was dealing with a confused woman who could be dismissed with the right legal pressure. She had no idea she was about to discover that her trusted family lawyer had been Robert's partner in a fraud that was far more extensive than bigamy. Over the following week, Christine's approach toward me shifted from confused sympathy to calculated intimidation. The grieving widow who'd shared tissues and tears in the funeral home was replaced by someone who viewed me as a threat to her children's inheritance and was prepared to fight accordingly. The campaign began with phone calls from Tom Richardson's office. His secretary, a woman with a voice like honey over steel, left messages explaining that I needed to provide documentation of my relationship with Robert to clarify any potential misunderstandings about estate claims. "Mrs. Sinclair," she said in the third message, "Mr. Richardson is prepared to meet with you to discuss your situation, but he'll need to see original documents proving your connection to the deceased, marriage certificates, joint tax returns, shared property deeds, that sort of thing. He wants to help resolve this matter as efficiently as possible." The request sounded reasonable on the surface, but Patricia Williams had warned me about this tactic. "They're fishing," she'd explained during one of our meetings. "Legitimate heirs don't usually need to provide proof of their relationships to family lawyers. When attorneys start demanding documentation, it's because they're building a case to challenge your standing." Meanwhile, Christine had begun her own investigation into my background. She'd found my photography studio's website and social media accounts, studying 15 years of my life with the intensity of someone preparing for battle. She called my business references, claiming to be considering me for wedding photography services. She drove past my house in Hawthorne, taking photos of the property and researching its ownership history. Her Facebook friend requests to mutual acquaintances were subtle but persistent. She'd reached out to people who'd known Robert and me as a couple, introducing herself as Bobby's widow and asking casual questions about our relationship dynamic. "I'm trying to understand Bobby's life before we met," she'd tell them. "Emma seems like such a sweet person. How long were they together before things ended?" The phrasing was clever. By assuming our relationship had ended rather than asking when it ended, Christine encouraged people to provide information that supported her narrative. Several mutual friends, confused by the timeline and not wanting to speak ill of the dead, had given Christine responses that made our marriage sound historical rather than ongoing. But Christine's most effective tactic was involving her children. Matthew and Sophie began appearing at locations where they might encounter me: the grocery store where Robert and I shopped, the coffee shop where I often worked on editing, the park where I sometimes photographed family portraits. They were always with Christine or her parents, always well-behaved, always heartbreakingly normal children dealing with the loss of their father. The message was clear. I was threatening the financial security of 2 innocent children who'd already lost the most important person in their world. Anyone observing these encounters would see a grieving widow trying to protect her family from a woman making questionable claims about their father's estate. "Emma," Christine called out when she spotted me at the Saturday farmers market, her voice carrying the false brightness of someone performing for an audience. "What a coincidence seeing you here. Kids, this is the lady I told you about, the one who knew your daddy from his work." The way she introduced me as someone who'd known their father professionally rather than personally was a masterclass in public relations. To any observers, I was being positioned as a business associate who might have legitimate professional connections to Robert, but no personal claim to his legacy. Sophie, the 8-year-old with Robert's green eyes, looked up at me with curious innocence. "Did you help Daddy with his computer work?" she asked. "He was always fixing people's computer problems." Computer work. Robert had been telling his children that his consulting business involved computer repair, which explained his technical knowledge while simplifying his work in a way children could understand. It was another lie designed to compartmentalize his different lives, preventing his children from asking questions about clients or projects that might reveal inconsistencies. Something like that, I said, not wanting to confuse or upset the children with complex explanations about their father's deception. Christine's smile was warm and understanding. Emma was very fond of your daddy, wasn't you, Emma? Sometimes when people work closely with someone, they develop special feelings that can be confusing after that person passes away. The psychological framework she was establishing was subtle but devastating. According to Christine's version of events, I was a lonely woman who developed an inappropriate attachment to a married client, possibly taking advantage of his illness and vulnerability to insert myself into his personal life. My grief was being reframed as the obsessive mourning of someone who'd never actually had a legitimate relationship with Robert. It must be hard, Christine continued, her voice dripping with false compassion, when someone you cared about professionally can't be there to clarify the nature of your relationship. I imagine it's easy to remember things as being more personal than they actually were. She was gaslighting me in public, using her children as props while building a narrative that would make any claims I made about Robert seem delusional or manipulative. The farmers market crowd was unconsciously absorbing her version of our dynamic, the legitimate widow being gracious toward a confused woman who was making everyone uncomfortable with inappropriate boundary violations. The campaign escalated when Christine arranged for Robert's memorial service at their church. She sent me an invitation that was both generous and humiliating. I was welcome to attend as a friend of the family who'd provided professional services during Robert's illness. The invitation listed me among his business associates rather than his personal relationships. At the service, Christine's pastor delivered a eulogy that painted Robert as a devoted family man who'd been generous with his time and expertise in helping others. He spoke about Bobby's commitment to his wife and children, his involvement in community activities, his reputation as someone who could be counted on to help neighbors and colleagues with professional advice. Bobby touched many lives through his work, the pastor said, looking directly at me in the section reserved for business associates. He was the kind of man who made everyone feel important, who gave generously of his expertise and compassion. We should remember that his greatest legacy isn't the professional relationships he maintained, but the family he loved unconditionally. The distinction was clear. Robert's professional relationships, however meaningful to the people involved, were secondary to his real commitment to his wife and children. Anyone seeking recognition or inheritance based on professional connections was missing the point of what truly mattered to Robert. After the service, Christine approached me with Tom Richardson at her side. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested successful handling of high-stakes legal matters. "Mrs. Sinclair," Richardson said, offering a handshake that felt more like a business negotiation than a greeting. "Christine has told me about your situation. I understand you have some questions about Robert's estate arrangements." "I have questions about my husband's will," I corrected. Richardson's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Mrs. Sinclair, I need to be direct with you. Christine Parker has been married to Robert Mitchell for 12 years. They have 2 minor children together. She has extensive documentation of their relationship, joint financial accounts, shared property ownership, and witnessed testimony from hundreds of community members who knew them as a married couple." He paused, letting the weight of Christine's evidence settle before delivering the challenge. "What exactly do you have to support your claim of marriage to the same man?" The question was designed to make me realize how weak my position appeared compared to Christine's comprehensive documentation of her relationship with Robert. But Richardson had made one crucial miscalculation. He was assuming I only had the evidence of a legitimate marriage. He had no idea I also had proof of a massive fraud that he'd helped orchestrate. That night, sitting in my kitchen with Patricia Williams' investigation files spread across the table, I began to understand the true scope of what Robert and Tom Richardson had constructed together. This wasn't just bigamy or estate fraud, it was a sophisticated financial conspiracy that had been years in the making. Patricia's surveillance had captured more than Robert's movements between two families. She documented his meetings with Richardson at locations far from the lawyer's downtown office, coffee shops in Gresham, parking lots in Tigard, even a bench at Laurelhurst Park, where they'd sat for over an hour reviewing documents that Richardson kept in a locked briefcase. These weren't normal attorney-client meetings, Patricia had noted in her report. Richardson was acting more like a co-conspirator than legal counsel. The secrecy, the off-site locations, the careful document handling, this suggests they were planning something that couldn't be discussed in traditional legal settings. The financial records Patricia had obtained painted an even more disturbing picture. Robert hadn't just been maintaining two households, he'd been systematically moving money between accounts in ways that suggested preparation for a major financial restructuring. Small transfers that individually looked innocuous, but collectively represented hundreds of thousands of dollars being repositioned for some specific purpose. But the most damning evidence was something Patricia had discovered by accident while following Robert to what she'd assumed was another clandestine meeting with Richardson. Instead, she'd watched Robert enter a building that housed several medical offices, including Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations for legal proceedings. "Your husband had been seeing Dr. Foster for 6 months," Patricia explained in her written summary, "not for mental health treatment, but for competency testing. The appointments were scheduled around the same time as his meetings with Richardson, and the billing went to a separate account that neither of your households would have seen." Competency evaluations were typically ordered by courts when there were questions about someone's ability to make legal decisions. But Robert had been pursuing these assessments voluntarily, building a paper trail that would support claims about his diminished capacity during the final months of his life. The implications were staggering. Robert had been creating evidence that he wasn't mentally competent to make major legal decisions, while simultaneously restructuring his entire estate. If anyone challenged his final arrangements, Richardson could argue that Robert's choices had been made during a period of documented cognitive decline caused by his medical condition. But Patricia's most significant discovery was hidden in Robert's phone records from the past year. Multiple calls to a number registered to something called Pacific Northwest Asset Recovery Services. When Patricia investigated the company, she found that it was owned by Richardson's brother-in-law and specialized in helping people hide assets during divorce proceedings and estate disputes. Robert had been preparing to disappear money where neither Christine nor I would be able to find it. The morning after my confrontation with Richardson at the memorial service, I drove to Patricia's office in Northwest Portland with a specific request. I needed her to dig deeper into Richardson's business relationships, particularly any connections to financial services that might be helping Robert conceal assets. "Emma, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated asset protection scheme," Patricia said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "If Robert has been working with Richardson to hide money offshore or in shell companies, we're talking about federal crimes, wire fraud, money laundering, possibly tax evasion." She pulled out a map of downtown Portland and began marking locations where her surveillance had captured Robert and Richardson meeting. The pattern that emerged was telling. They'd been avoiding Richardson's office and meeting instead near banks, investment firms, and currency exchange services. This suggests they were conducting business that Richardson didn't want associated with his legitimate legal practice, Patricia observed. When lawyers start weeding clients in parking lots and coffee shops, it's usually because they're discussing activities that could get them disbarred. Patricia's investigation over the next week revealed connections that went far beyond simple estate fraud. Richardson had been helping multiple clients restructure their finances in ways that protected assets from spouses, creditors, and tax authorities. Robert's case wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern of legal services that operated in the gray areas between asset protection and fraud. The most disturbing discovery was that Richardson had been billing Robert for services that extended far beyond estate planning. Legal research on bigamy laws in Oregon, consultation fees for advice on maintaining multiple identities, even payments for what Richardson's records described as relationship management strategies. Robert had been paying his lawyer to help him maintain his double life more effectively. But the evidence that would ultimately destroy both Robert's legacy and Richardson's career was hidden in Robert's safe deposit box, the one Christine didn't know about. Patricia had identified the box during her financial investigation, and after Robert's death, my status as his legal spouse gave me access to its contents. Inside the box, I found documents that revealed the full scope of Robert and Richardson's conspiracy. Fake business licenses for the consulting companies that had never actually existed. Bank signature cards for accounts opened under slight variations of Robert's name. Most damaging of all, a detailed timeline showing how they'd planned to execute what Robert called his final transition. The plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. Robert had never intended to choose between his two families. Instead, he'd been preparing to die in a way that would leave Christine believing she was his sole heir, while simultaneously providing me with evidence that would destroy her claims and expose Richardson's role in the fraud. Robert's cancer diagnosis had accelerated their timeline, but the basic strategy had been in development for over 2 years. He would die under circumstances that made his mental competency questionable, leaving behind a will that appeared to favor Christine and the children. When I inevitably challenged the will, Richardson would produce evidence of Robert's diminished capacity, arguing that his final legal decisions weren't valid. But here's where Robert's plan became truly diabolical. He'd been secretly documenting Richardson's fraudulent activities, creating evidence that would destroy the lawyer's credibility when the estate case went to court. Richardson thought he was helping Robert hide assets from his wives. In reality, Robert had been setting him up to take the fall for a conspiracy that would ultimately benefit neither family. The safe deposit box contained recordings of Richardson admitting to tax fraud, copies of documents showing his involvement in money laundering, even photographs of meetings where Richardson had accepted cash payments for services that weren't reported to the Bar Association. Robert had been planning to die in a way that would trigger a legal battle between his two wives, knowing that the investigation would ultimately expose Richardson's crimes and result in the recovery of millions of dollars in hidden assets. Money that would then be distributed according to Oregon's intestate succession laws, giving both families a share while ensuring that Richardson would be destroyed in the process. The man I'd been married to for 15 years hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been orchestrating a post-mortem revenge scheme that would ruin everyone who'd trusted him, including the children who carried his name. But Robert had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that when I discovered the evidence in his safe deposit box, I would use it to destroy Christine and Richardson according to his plan. He'd never considered that I might have moral objections to carrying out a scheme that would devastate 2 innocent children and their mother. The question now was whether to honor Robert's intentions or to find a way to protect the people he'd planned to sacrifice for his twisted sense of justice. The real scope of Robert's deception became clear when I found the key to his second safe deposit box, the one even Patricia Williams hadn't discovered. It was taped inside an old camera case in our basement, hidden among photography equipment I rarely used anymore. The key was accompanied with a handwritten note in Robert's careful script. For Emma, when you understand what I've really been building. The box was registered under one of Robert's business aliases at a bank in Lake Oswego, far from either of our neighborhoods. Inside, I found documents that revealed Robert's true masterpiece wasn't his double life or his revenge scheme against Richardson. It was something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. The man I'd been married to for 15 years hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been orchestrating a post-mortem revenge scheme that would ruin everyone who trusted him, including the children who carried his name. But Robert had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that when I discovered the evidence in his safe deposit box, I would use it to destroy Christine and Richardson according to his plan. He'd never considered that I might have moral objections to carrying out a scheme that would devastate 2 innocent children and their mother. The question now was whether to honor Robert's intentions or to find a way to protect the people he'd planned to sacrifice for his twisted sense of justice. The real scope of Robert's deception became clear when I found the key to his second safe deposit box, the one even Patricia Williams hadn't discovered. It was taped inside an old camera case in our basement, hidden among photography equipment I rarely used anymore. The key was accompanied by a handwritten note in Robert's careful script. For Emma, when you understand what I've really been building. The box was registered under one of Robert's business aliases at a bank in Lake Oswego, far from either of our neighborhoods. Inside, I found documents that revealed Robert's true masterpiece wasn't his double life or his revenge scheme. It was something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. Robert had been stealing from his clients, not the fake consulting clients he'd invented to justify his travel schedule, but real companies that had hired him for legitimate technical work over the years. Small amounts at first, skimmed from project budgets and development funds, but growing bolder as he perfected his methods. The documentation was meticulous. Bank account numbers, transfer authorizations, even screenshots of the software systems he'd created to hide the theft. Robert had been embezzling money from over 40 different companies, ranging from small startups to major corporations with household names. But the genius of his scheme wasn't the theft itself, it was how he'd been investing the stolen money. Robert had used his ill-gotten gains to purchase cryptocurrency early in its development, when Bitcoin was trading for pennies and most people considered it worthless speculation. The wallet addresses and private keys in the safe deposit box represented a fortune that had grown exponentially over the past decade. What had started as perhaps a few $100,000 in stolen funds had become a cryptocurrency portfolio worth over $50 million. Robert hadn't been planning to choose between his two families because he'd been building wealth that could support both households in luxury for generations. The bigamy, the elaborate scheduling, the careful compartmentalization, all of it had been designed to buy him time while his cryptocurrency investments matured into a generational fortune. But there was something else in the safe deposit box that changed everything, a detailed confession. Not just of the bigamy or the embezzlement, but of the systematic way Robert had been manipulating both Christine and me to ensure we'd never discover his crimes. The confession revealed that Robert's cancer diagnosis was real, but his prognosis had been far better than he'd told either of us. The doctors had expected him to recover fully with treatment. Robert had chosen to refuse the most effective medications, allowing the cancer to progress while using his deteriorating condition to justify increasingly erratic behavior. He'd been slowly poisoning himself to death to avoid facing the consequences of his crimes. The confession explained Robert's real plan for his hidden fortune. After his death, both wives would eventually discover evidence of his theft and embezzlement. The resulting FBI investigation would freeze all traditional assets, while authorities traced the money back to its legitimate owners. But the cryptocurrency wallets would remain hidden, protected by encryption and accessible only to whoever found the keys in the safe deposit box. Robert had expected me to be the one to find this final cash, based on his assessment of my investigative skills versus Christine's trusting nature. He'd been counting on my methodical approach to unraveling his deceptions, knowing I would eventually discover all the layers of his scheme. But the confession revealed something that made me physically sick. Robert had been testing both families during his final months, evaluating our reactions to stress and financial pressure to determine who deserved to inherit his stolen fortune. The medical appointments, the insurance updates, the legal meetings with Richardson, all of it had been designed to observe how Christine and I responded to uncertainty about our financial futures. According to his notes, I had passed his test by hiring Patricia Williams and conducting my own investigation. I'd shown the initiative and intelligence Robert believed necessary to manage a complex criminal inheritance. Christine, by contrast, had failed by trusting Richardson and accepting legal advice without conducting independent research. In Robert's twisted logic, I had earned the right to inherit his stolen millions by proving I was capable of the same moral flexibility he'd demonstrated throughout his adult life. The confession included detailed instructions for accessing the cryptocurrency wallets, laundering the money through legitimate investments, and creating a paper trail that would make the funds appear to come from legal sources. Robert had spent years researching money laundering techniques, studying how criminals converted illegal gains into respectable wealth. But he'd also included something unexpected, evidence that would allow me to return the stolen money to its rightful owners if I chose to do so. Bank routing numbers, corporate contact information, even calculations showing how much interest and penalties should be added to make the victims whole. Robert had given me the choice between becoming wealthy through his crimes or doing the right thing at considerable personal cost. It was his final test, delivered from beyond the grave.
The documentation in the safe deposit box also revealed why Richardson had been so confident about challenging my inheritance claims. Robert had told the lawyer about the cryptocurrency portfolio, promising Richardson a substantial percentage for handling the legal complications after his death. Richardson thought he was positioning Christine to inherit the traditional assets while secretly preparing to claim the real fortune for himself. Neither Richardson nor Christine knew about the confession or the evidence of Robert's crimes. They were both operating under the assumption that Robert's hidden wealth came from legitimate investments and business success. When the estate case went to court, Richardson planned to produce evidence that would give Christine the house and savings accounts while directing the cryptocurrency windfall to shell companies he controlled. Robert had been playing everyone against each other, promising each person something different, while maintaining control over who would ultimately benefit from his lifetime of deception and theft. But as I sat in my car outside the Lake Oswego Bank, holding $50 million worth of stolen cryptocurrency keys, I realized Robert had made one final miscalculation. He'd assumed that discovering his crimes would make me complicit in them, that knowing about the stolen money would corrupt me the same way it had corrupted him. He'd never considered that learning the truth about his character might make me more determined to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. The confession had revealed that Robert viewed both his families as investments in his own legacy, relationships he'd cultivated to serve his purposes, rather than people he genuinely loved. Christine and her children, me and our marriage, even Richardson's legal services, we'd all been tools in a scheme designed to benefit only Robert himself. But Robert was dead, and the choice of what to do with his stolen legacy was now mine alone. I could follow his instructions and become wealthy beyond imagination, or I could find a way to return the money to its rightful owners, while protecting Christine and her children from the consequences of their father's crimes. The question was whether justice required destroying the lives Robert had built with stolen money, or whether mercy demanded finding a way to make things right without punishing the innocent people who'd been unknowing beneficiaries of his theft. 2 weeks after discovering Robert's confession, I arranged to meet with FBI Special Agent David Torres. I couldn't simply turn over Robert's confession and walk away. Christine and her children deserved protection from the legal catastrophe about to unfold. My plan required perfect timing. Richardson expected me to escalate my inheritance dispute, playing into the legal battle he'd orchestrated with Robert. Instead, I would give him exactly what he thought he wanted, while documenting his criminal behavior for federal investigators. I called Richardson's office requesting an urgent meeting about new evidence regarding Robert's estate. His secretary scheduled the appointment for Friday, giving me 5 days to coordinate with Agent Torres. "Mrs. Sinclair, what you're describing could make you an accessory after the fact," Agent Torres warned during our initial meeting. "If you knew about your husband's crimes and failed to report them, that's a federal offense." "I'm reporting them now," I replied, "and I'm offering to help recover stolen funds and gather evidence against Richardson, but I need guarantees that Christine Parker and her children will be protected." Agent Torres explained the FBI typically offered immunity deals to cooperating witnesses who provided evidence leading to asset recovery and prosecution of other criminals. If I could deliver Richardson and help trace Robert's embezzlement network, they'd negotiate protections for Robert's victims. The plan was elegant. I would meet Richardson while wearing an FBI wire, presenting selected portions of Robert's confession to make Richardson believe he could access the cryptocurrency fortune without revealing I knew about his planned betrayal of Christine. Richardson's greed would expose his criminal activities while trying to negotiate a larger share of stolen wealth. But the setup required Christine's presence when Richardson's true nature was exposed.
She needed to witness his betrayal firsthand to protect her legally and free her from his emotional manipulation. 3 days before the meeting, I called Christine with news of a breakthrough in understanding Robert's financial arrangements. I found documents suggesting Robert had significant investment accounts we didn't know about, accounts that could benefit both families if we handled the legal issues correctly. Christine eagerly agreed to join the Friday meeting. Richardson's secretary confirmed the additional attendee wouldn't be a problem. The conference room could accommodate a larger group. Meanwhile, Agent Torres coordinated with the Oregon State Bar Association and IRS to ensure Richardson's crimes would be prosecuted at federal and state levels. The evidence showed tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy stretching back 5 years. The most crucial element involved timing the revelation of Robert's embezzlement network. Agent Torres needed Richardson to incriminate himself before learning the stolen cryptocurrency would be returned to rightful owners. If Richardson realized early there would be no fortune to steal, he might avoid making admissions guaranteeing his prosecution. The night before the meeting, I reviewed the script Agent Torres and I had developed. I would present Richardson with edited portions of Robert's confession, focusing on cryptocurrency wallets while omitting evidence of Richardson's planned betrayal. Richardson's response would reveal whether he was genuinely protecting clients or planning to steal money for himself. Based on Robert's confession, I knew exactly which option Richardson would choose. Richardson's conference room was designed to intimidate. Christine sat beside me while Richardson reviewed the edited portions of Robert's confession I'd provided. "This is extraordinary," Richardson said, unable to hide his excitement. "Emma, where exactly did you find these documents?" "In Robert's safe deposit box," I replied, "the one I accessed as his surviving spouse." Christine looked up sharply. "Bobby had a safe deposit box I didn't know about?" Richardson's smile was reassuring. "Christine, it's common for business owners to maintain separate security arrangements. This doesn't reflect any lack of trust in your relationship." I could see the calculation in his eyes. Richardson was already planning how to access the cryptocurrency wallets, mentally calculating his percentage of $50 million. "The question is how we handle this discovery legally," Richardson continued. "Cryptocurrency presents unique challenges in estate law." "What kind of challenges?" Christine asked. "Well, technically, these assets belong to Robert's estate and should be distributed according to his will. But if we're not careful about reporting this discovery, it could trigger tax complications that would significantly reduce the inheritance." "Are you suggesting we don't report the discovery?" I asked, giving him the opening he wanted. "I'm suggesting we explore all options before making hasty decisions. If these cryptocurrency wallets were accessed gradually and converted to legitimate investments, the tax implications could be managed more efficiently." Christine frowned. "Tom, that sounds like hiding money from the government." Richardson's laugh was condescending. "Christine, I'm talking about sophisticated tax planning. Wealthy families use these strategies constantly." "What about Emma's claims to the estate?" Christine asked. This was the moment I'd waited for. Richardson pulled out a thick folder I recognized as fabricated evidence. "Actually, I've been researching Emma's situation extensively. There are significant questions about the validity of her marriage to Robert." He spread documents across the table. "These records show discrepancies in Emma's marriage certificate, inconsistencies in her tax filings, witness testimony suggesting her relationship with Robert was primarily professional." Christine stared at the documents, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "But Emma has been married to Bobby for 15 years. "Mental illness can manifest in elaborate delusions," Richardson said gently. "Emma may genuinely believe she was married to Robert, but belief doesn't create legal reality." "Tom," I said quietly, "what happens to the cryptocurrency while you're challenging my marriage?" His smile was predatory. "Those assets would need management by a qualified trustee during legal proceedings, someone with expertise in complex financial matters." "Someone like you?" "If the court appointed me, yes. Trustee fees for managing such assets would be substantial, but that's a small price for professional oversight." Christine looked uncomfortable.
Tom, I don't want to steal anything from Emma if she has legitimate claims. Richardson's expression hardened. Christine, you have 2 children to think about. Sometimes protecting your family requires making difficult decisions. What kind of difficult decisions? The kind that ensure your children's futures aren't diminished by fraudulent claims from strangers. The caring lawyer facade was slipping. Tom, I said, what exactly are you proposing we do with the cryptocurrency?
Richardson leaned closer, checking for eavesdroppers. I'm proposing we access those wallets immediately, before any court proceedings. Convert the cryptocurrency to cash through offshore exchanges, then invest in legitimate assets that can't be traced. Isn't that money laundering? Christine whispered. It's asset protection. The only difference is starting with cryptocurrency instead of traditional investments. Richardson's greed overrode his caution. Christine, I've been helping families protect assets for years. When marriages end or family members make inappropriate claims, sometimes the only way to preserve what belongs to the children is to move money where it can't be found. How many families? I asked. Dozens. I've protected millions from ex-spouses, creditors, and government agencies. The key is establishing offshore structures before anyone realizes the money exists. Christine stood abruptly. Tom, you're talking about stealing money. How is that different from robbery? Richardson's expression shifted, more threatening. Christine, think carefully about what's best for your children. Emma's claims will tie everything up for years. Matthew and Sophie won't have college funds, house payments will become your responsibility, and you'll drown in legal fees. He leaned back casually. On the other hand, if we handle this properly, your children will be secure for life. Sometimes being a good mother means making choices others might not understand. The threat was clear: cooperate or watch your children suffer. The conference room door opened sharply. Agent Torres entered with 2 FBI agents, badges visible, expressions grimly professional. Tom Richardson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit theft. Richardson's face drained of color as agents surrounded him. There's been some mistake. I'm a licensed attorney. I don't know what this is about. We have recordings of you admitting to multiple felonies, Agent Torres replied, producing handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Christine sat frozen, watching her trusted family lawyer being read his Miranda rights. The transformation was so sudden, she seemed unable to process what was happening. Emma, she whispered, what's going on? Why are the FBI here? Before I could answer, Richardson's composure cracked entirely. The smooth professional demeanor shattered as he realized his legal jeopardy. You set me up, he snarled at me, his face contorting with rage. You lying bitch, you've been recording this whole meeting. Agent Torres stepped between Richardson and me. Mr. Richardson, I strongly advise you to stop talking. But Richardson was beyond rational behavior. The prospect of federal prison had stripped away all pretense, revealing the desperate criminal beneath the respectable facade. Christine, don't listen to her, he shouted, as agents led him toward the door. Emma's been lying about everything. She's not Robert's real wife, she's some psychotic stalker who fabricated evidence to steal your children's inheritance. The accusations poured out in panic and hatred. She hired private investigators to spy on your family. She broke into Robert's medical records. She's been planning this for months, trying to destroy your family so she can steal money belonging to Matthew and Sophie. Christine stared in horror, finally seeing the man she'd trusted with her family's future for what he really was. Tom, stop, just stop talking. But Richardson couldn't stop. His career was over, his freedom gone, and his only hope was convincing someone that I was the real villain. Ask her about the cryptocurrency wallets. He screamed as agents reached the door. Ask her how she really found them. Ask her why she's working with the FBI instead of protecting Robert's legacy. The door closed behind Richardson, leaving Christine and me alone, with the echo of his accusations and devastating silence. Christine sat motionless, staring at scattered legal documents Richardson had left behind. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Known what?" "That Tom was planning to steal from us. That he was never trying to protect my children." She looked up with eyes full of betrayal and confusion. "How long have you been working with the FBI?" I pulled out the recording device Agent Torres had given me, setting it between us. "Since I found Robert's confession 2 weeks ago. Christine, your husband wasn't just leading a double life. He was embezzling money from his clients and working with Richardson to hide stolen funds." I opened my briefcase and pulled out copies of documents from Robert's safe deposit box. Robert stole over $50 million in cryptocurrency using money he embezzled from dozens of companies. Richardson was planning to claim that fortune for himself, while convincing you that I was mentally ill and had fabricated our marriage. Christine stared at the confession, hands shaking as she turned pages. "This can't be real. Bobby wouldn't steal money. He was honest, ethical, he cared about doing the right thing. Robert cared about protecting himself," I said gently. "Everything else was secondary, including both our families." The truth was devastating, but Christine needed to understand the complete scope of Robert's deception. Her house, her children's college funds, even grocery money, all purchased with stolen cryptocurrency gains. "But the companies Bobby consulted for," Christine protested, "Walker Construction, Harrison Financial, those were legitimate clients, weren't they?" I shook my head. "Those companies exist, but Robert never worked for them. He created fake contracts to justify his travel schedule while stealing from other businesses entirely." Christine buried her face in her hands. "Oh God, Matthew and Sophie, everything they have, it's all stolen money, isn't it?" The question hung like a death sentence. Robert's children had been living in a house purchased with embezzled funds, attending schools paid for with stolen cryptocurrency, planning educations funded by criminal proceeds. "What happens now?" Christine asked. "Agent Torres will interview you about your knowledge of Robert's business activities. The FBI will trace every stolen dollar and work to return money to victimized companies. Eventually, there will be civil lawsuits seeking to recover stolen funds from anyone who benefited." Christine looked up sharply. "They're going to sue me, take my house, take the kids' college money, probably. Asset forfeiture laws prevent criminals from benefiting from their crimes, even indirectly." From Robert's confession, showing the payments Richardson had received for money laundering services, the legal strategies he'd developed to protect criminal proceeds, the detailed plans for stealing the cryptocurrency fortune after Robert's death. "Richardson was never protecting your family's interests," I continued. "He was protecting a criminal conspiracy that would have left you and your children with nothing while he disappeared with $50 million in stolen funds." Christine stared at the evidence, her understanding of the past 12 years crumbling with each revelation. The man she'd trusted to guide her through the most difficult period of her life had been planning to rob her children while framing me for crimes I'd never committed. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would Tom do this to us? We trusted him. The kids called him Uncle Tom. He came to birthday parties, he knew our family. Because Richardson is a sociopath who views other people as resources to be exploited," I said bluntly. "He maintained relationships with you and Robert because those relationships were profitable. When Robert died and left behind millions in stolen cryptocurrency, Richardson saw an opportunity to claim that fortune for himself." The conference room door opened again, and Agent Torres returned with a folder thick with legal documents. "Mrs. Parker, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, taking a seat at the table. "I need to explain what happens next, and I'm afraid it's going to be difficult for both of you to hear." Agent Torres opened his folder and spread out a timeline that showed the scope of the FBI's investigation. "Based on Mrs. Sinclair's cooperation, we've identified 43 companies victimized by Robert's embezzlement scheme. The total stolen exceeds $52 million. Christine stared at the numbers. 52 million. Bobby's consulting business only brought in maybe 200,000 a year. Mrs. Parker, your husband was using his technical skills to access client financial systems and transfer money to cryptocurrency wallets he controlled. Over 15 years, those small thefts accumulated into a massive fortune. Agent Torres pulled out another document. Your house was purchased with proceeds from stolen funds. The same is true for your children's college accounts and most household assets. What does that mean for Matthew and Sophie? Christine asked. Under asset forfeiture laws, property purchased with criminal proceeds is subject to seizure. However, Mrs. Sinclair has made a proposal that could protect your children. Christine looked at me with desperate hope. What kind of proposal? Your children are innocent victims, I said simply. They don't deserve to be punished for their father's choices. Agent Torres nodded. Mrs. Sinclair has agreed to cooperate fully and facilitate the return of all stolen cryptocurrency. In exchange, the FBI will recommend that the court allow you to retain certain assets for your children's basic needs. Your house will likely be sold, but proceeds above the mortgage balance could be placed in a trust for Matthew and Sophie's education. Agent Torres explained. Your vehicles and personal property would remain yours.
Christine turned to me, tears streaming. Why would you help us? After everything Bobby did, why would you care what happens to my children? Because they didn't choose to have a criminal father, I replied. They deserve a chance at a normal life. What about Richardson? Christine asked. Tom Richardson faces 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering. His law license will be revoked. Christine shook her head. Tom has a wife, children of his own. Richardson's family will face similar asset forfeiture proceedings, Agent Torres said. The difference is that Mrs. Richardson was likely aware of her husband's activities, while you were genuinely deceived. There's something else, Agent Torres continued. Richardson has been operating this scheme for at least a decade. We're looking at dozens of additional victims and millions more in stolen assets. The pattern was clear. Richardson had been preying on vulnerable families for years, using his legal expertise to facilitate financial abuse while positioning himself to claim the proceeds of his clients' crimes. 3 days after Richardson's arrest, Agent Torres called with updates revealing the scope of the criminal network. We found evidence Richardson had been running this operation for over 12 years, with your husband as one of his earliest partners. Richardson had targeted people in vulnerable situations, divorces, deaths, business disputes, offering asset protection services while systematically stealing their money. Robert had been recruited for his technical skills, developing sophisticated cryptocurrency laundering methods. Christine and I met at her house in Selwood. The FBI had finished processing it as evidence, and she was allowed to return while legal proceedings determined its fate. The kids keep asking when things will go back to normal, Christine said. I don't know how to explain that normal doesn't exist anymore. Matthew and Sophie were staying with Christine's parents while she dealt with the legal complexity. The children knew their father had died and there were grown-up problems to solve, but didn't understand their childhood had been funded by stolen money. Have you decided what to tell them about Robert? I asked. Christine stared at family photos lining the mantelpiece. I keep thinking they deserve the truth, but how do you tell children their father was a criminal? The companies Robert stole from are being reasonable about asset recovery, I offered. They understand you and the children are victims too. There's something else I need to tell you, Christine said, pulling out financial documents. I've been working with a new lawyer to calculate how much of our assets came from legitimate versus stolen sources. The analysis was heartbreaking. Christine's lawyer had traced every major purchase back to its source. Less than 15% of their wealth had come from legitimate income. Bobby's actual consulting work brought in about $30,000 a year, Christine explained. Everything else came from cryptocurrency sales funded by embezzled money. Christine's decision was remarkable. I'm not going to fight the asset forfeiture. I'm not going to hire expensive lawyers to keep money stolen from innocent people. Bobby's victims deserve their money back, even if my children and I lose everything. Her choice meant full cooperation with restitution, allowing stolen funds to be returned within months rather than years of litigation. "The companies Bobby stole from have families too," she said. "My children don't deserve security more than those families deserve justice." 6 months after Richardson's arrest, the criminal cases began moving through the federal court system with devastating efficiency. Richardson had initially planned to fight the charges, claiming he'd been manipulated by Robert and was as much a victim as anyone else. But the evidence Agent Torres had gathered was overwhelming. The recordings from our meeting showed Richardson admitting to multiple felonies while threatening to destroy Christine's family if she didn't cooperate with his money laundering scheme. His own computer files revealed years of criminal activity involving dozens of clients. Most damaging of all, Robert's confession had documented Richardson's role in developing the cryptocurrency laundering operation from its inception. Faced with evidence that guaranteed conviction at trial, Richardson finally accepted a plea agreement: 25 years in federal prison, complete disbarment, and forfeiture of all assets linked to his criminal activities. His wife and teenage children lost their home, their savings, and their father's reputation in a single court hearing.
Richardson's sentencing was brutal to watch, Agent Torres told me afterward. His family was in the courtroom crying while the judge read the victim impact statements from the companies he'd helped Robert steal from. One small business owner talked about laying off employees because Richardson had embezzled their payroll funds. The human cost of Richardson's crimes extended far beyond the dollar amounts involved. Families had lost their homes when small businesses failed due to embezzlement. Employees had been laid off when their companies couldn't make payroll after Richardson and Robert drained their accounts. Retirees had seen their pension funds disappear when Richardson helped hide assets from government oversight. But Richardson's downfall had also triggered a broader investigation that was exposing criminal networks throughout the Pacific Northwest. The FBI had identified at least 30 other lawyers and financial advisors who were using similar schemes to help clients hide money from spouses, creditors, and tax authorities. "Your husband's case broke open a conspiracy that was stealing hundreds of millions of dollars," Agent Torres explained. Richardson was just one node in a network that included lawyers, accountants, cryptocurrency exchanges, and offshore banking services. The investigation had revealed that Robert's embezzlement operation was relatively small compared to some of the schemes Richardson had facilitated. Divorce cases where spouses had hidden millions in overseas accounts, business partnerships dissolved through systematic theft, even inheritance cases where lawyers had stolen from their own clients' estates. Christine's situation, tragic as it was, represented one of the more hopeful outcomes in the broader investigation. Unlike many of Richardson's victims, she had chosen to cooperate fully with law enforcement and had been protected from criminal prosecution. Her children would lose their financial inheritance, but they would retain their freedom and their futures. Other families weren't as fortunate. Several of Richardson's clients were facing federal charges for their own roles in money laundering schemes. Spouses who had knowingly helped hide assets were being prosecuted alongside their partners. Children of criminals were discovering that their college educations had been funded by stolen money that would have to be returned. The restitution process was particularly complex in cases involving cryptocurrency. Unlike traditional bank accounts, digital currency wallets could be difficult to trace and recover. Some of the companies Robert had embezzled from would receive full restitution, while others would recover only partial amounts depending on what assets could be located. The cryptocurrency recovery alone will take years, Agent Torres admitted. "We're working with international law enforcement to trace funds through multiple exchanges and jurisdictions. Some of the money may never be recovered." But there was also positive news emerging from the investigation. Several cryptocurrency exchanges had implemented new security measures designed to detect the kind of systematic theft Robert had perpetrated. Financial institutions were developing better oversight procedures for detecting unusual transaction patterns. Even small businesses were learning to protect themselves from the technical vulnerabilities Robert had exploited. The companies that did receive restitution were often generous in their approach to the Victim Assistance Fund. Understanding that innocent families like Christine's had been harmed by the same criminals who had stolen from them,
several businesses had contributed additional money to help those families rebuild their lives. Christine had used her assistance fund allocation to enroll in a nursing program, returning to the career she'd abandoned when she married Robert and became financially dependent on his supposed consulting income. It was difficult balancing education with raising 2 children alone, but she was determined to build a legitimate life that didn't depend on anyone else's financial support. "I wake up every morning knowing that everything I have I've earned honestly," she told me. "That's worth more than any amount of stolen money could have been," she told me, during one of our occasional coffee meetings. Matthew and Sophie were adjusting to their new circumstances with the resilience that children often display in the face of adult catastrophes. They'd moved to a smaller apartment in a less expensive neighborhood, but they were still in the same school district and maintained friendships that provided stability during the transition. The hardest part for them was understanding why their father's reputation had been destroyed. Other children at school had heard their parents discussing the case, and Matthew in particular struggled with defending a father he was gradually learning had been very different from the man he'd known.
"We decided to be honest with them about Bobby's crimes," Christine explained. "Not the technical details, but the basic truth that their father had stolen money from innocent people and that we're working to make things right." The children's counselor had recommended this approach, suggesting that age-appropriate honesty would be healthier in the long term than elaborate deceptions designed to protect their father's memory. Matthew and Sophie would grow up knowing their father had made terrible choices, but they would also understand that they weren't responsible for his crimes or defined by his legacy. For me, watching Christine rebuild her life had been both inspiring and humbling. She'd lost everything she'd thought was real about her marriage and her financial security, yet she'd chosen to respond with integrity and determination rather than bitterness or self-pity. The contrast with my own situation was stark. As Robert's legal wife, I'd inherited all the assets that predated his criminal activities: our house in Hawthorne, our joint savings account, even my photography equipment and business. These assets weren't subject to forfeiture because they'd been purchased with legitimate income from before Robert began his embezzlement scheme. I'd essentially been rewarded for being Robert's first victim, while Christine and her children were being punished for being his most recent ones. 1 year after Robert's death, I sold our house in Hawthorne and used the proceeds to establish the Robert Mitchell Victims Recovery Foundation, a nonprofit helping families harmed by financial crimes. Living in the house where Robert and I had shared 15 years of carefully constructed lies had become unbearable. Every room contained poisoned memories: the home office where he'd planned his schemes, the kitchen where he'd taken calls from Christine while I cooked dinner, the bedroom where he'd held me while lying about his other life. Creating something positive from the wreckage gave me purpose that mere survival couldn't provide. Robert had stolen my ability to trust, but I could help other families navigate similar betrayals. The foundation's first client was Christine herself. The Victim Assistance Fund had helped her through nursing school, but she needed ongoing support transitioning to financial independence. "I never expected to be starting over at 35, she said during our first official meeting. "When I married Bobby, I thought I was set for life. I gave up my nursing career because we didn't need my income." That was part of Robert's strategy, encouraging both of us to become financially dependent, ensuring we'd be less likely to ask difficult questions about his wealth sources. The foundation connected Christine with other families experiencing similar betrayals, people who understood the unique trauma of discovering their lives had been built on criminal proceeds. "The isolation is the worst part," explained Maria Santos, whose husband had embezzled from his employer. "People think you must have known something. They don't understand how sophisticated these deceptions can be." Support group meetings revealed disturbing patterns, but also remarkable resilience. Wives kept deliberately ignorant of husbands' business activities, children raised in luxury without knowing their fathers were criminals, but also families choosing honesty over denial, cooperating with law enforcement rather than fighting to keep stolen assets. My photography work evolved from hobby to full-time career, documenting social justice issues, specializing in families affected by financial crimes. Each photograph told stories of ordinary people disrupted by others' greed, but also stories of recovery and community support. A photo exhibition at Portland's Museum Craft drew attention from law enforcement and victim advocacy groups. Agent Torres studied images of Richardson's former client thoughtfully. These photographs show something spreadsheets and court documents can't capture, he said, the human reality of financial crimes and the recovery that's possible when people face the truth. The exhibition led to speaking opportunities at financial crimes conferences. Initially difficult because they required reliving painful experiences publicly, these presentations helped other families navigate similar situations. Intelligent, educated people can be completely deceived by criminals they trust, I would tell audiences. The sophistication has nothing to do with victims' intelligence. It has everything to do with criminals' willingness to exploit trust. Gara had once tried to gaslight me about my relationship with Robert. Yes, I told her honestly, I loved the man I thought he was, but that man wasn't real. Your father created a character for me to love, just like he created a different character for your mother to love.
Were you sad when you found out he wasn't real? Matthew asked with the directness that 10-year-olds could bring to impossible questions. I was heartbroken, I said, but learning the truth was still better than living a lie, even if the lie was more comfortable. 2 years after Robert's death, I stood in the cemetery where his funeral had taken place, where Christine and I had first discovered each other's existence. The headstone still read, Robert James Mitchell, beloved husband and father, though the irony of that inscription had taken on layers of meaning I couldn't have imagined that first devastating day. The cemetery visit wasn't about grief anymore. It was about closure, about finally understanding the full scope of what Robert had done and why he'd chosen to orchestrate his own destruction rather than face the consequences of his crimes. Agent Torres had recently closed the last aspects of the financial investigation, and his final report revealed details about Robert's state of mind during his final months that no one had suspected. Hidden among his personal papers, investigators had found a journal documenting his growing awareness that his criminal empire was unsustainable. Robert had known his embezzlement would eventually be discovered. The companies he'd stolen from were implementing better security measures. Richardson's other criminal activities were attracting law enforcement attention. The cryptocurrency markets he'd relied on for laundering were facing increased government regulation. Most significantly, Robert had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer that had an excellent prognosis with proper treatment. His decision to refuse the most effective medications hadn't been about avoiding a longer legal battle. It had been about maintaining control over the narrative of his life until the very end. He orchestrated his own death, Agent Torres had explained during our final meeting, because he couldn't bear the thought of spending 20 years in federal prison while his victims recovered their money and his families learned the truth about his character. The journal revealed that Robert viewed his death as the ultimate manipulation, a way to trigger events that would expose Richardson's crimes while positioning both his wives to benefit from the restitution process. He'd expected Christine and I to fight over his estate, leading to investigations that would recover the stolen millions while destroying the lawyer he'd come to see as a liability. But Robert had fundamentally misunderstood both women he'd claimed to love. He'd assumed we would be motivated by greed and self-interest, that discovering his hidden fortune would corrupt us the same way wealth had corrupted him. He'd never considered that we might choose integrity over financial advantage, or that we might work together to protect innocent people rather than competing to inherit stolen money. Standing beside Robert's grave, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Christine the previous week. She'd completed her nursing program and found a position at a pediatric clinic, work that gave her genuine satisfaction after years of financial dependence on criminal proceeds. I make $38,000 a year, she'd told me with pride that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. Every penny of it honest, every day of work something I can be proud of. Matthew and Sophie understand that we don't have much money, but they also understand that what we have is ours. The children were thriving despite the dramatic change in their circumstances. Matthew had discovered a talent for mathematics that might lead to college scholarships, while Sophie had found joy in community theater programs that cost nothing but provided rich creative experiences. They were learning that happiness didn't require the expensive lifestyle their father had provided through theft. Christine's transformation had been remarkable, but it wasn't unique among the Foundation's clients.
Time after time, I'd watched families discover strength they didn't know they possessed when they chose honesty over denial, moral clarity over financial advantage. The foundation now served over 200 families affected by financial crimes, providing support that ranged from practical assistance to emotional counseling. The network of people who'd survived financial betrayal had become a community that supported each other through the complex process of rebuilding lives shattered by crimes they'd never known were being committed. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Robert's crimes wasn't the money recovered or the criminals prosecuted. It was the relationships that had emerged from the wreckage of his deception. Christine and I had become genuine friends, bound by shared experience in ways that had nothing to do with the man who'd betrayed us both. Our children, for I'd come to think of Matthew and Sophie as family, were growing up with an understanding of moral complexity that would serve them well in navigating their own adult relationships. They'd learned that love wasn't always honest, that trust required verification, and that sometimes the people who seemed most reliable were the ones capable of the deepest deception. As I prepared to leave the cemetery, I noticed fresh flowers on Robert's grave. Not expensive funeral arrangements, but a simple bouquet of wildflowers that looked like something a child might have picked. A small card was tucked among the stems. "We forgive you, but we won't forget. M and S." Matthew and Sophie had chosen to visit their father's grave without telling either Christine or me. They'd decided on their own to offer forgiveness while maintaining clear boundaries about his legacy. It was a level of emotional sophistication that spoke well for their future relationships and moral development. The final lesson of Robert's elaborate deception wasn't about the sophisticated methods criminals use to steal money or maintain double lives. It was about the power of choosing integrity when integrity comes at great personal cost, about finding strength in truth even when lies would be more comfortable. Robert had spent 15 years constructing elaborate falsehoods designed to let him have everything he wanted without facing consequences for his choices. His death had triggered events that exposed every lie, recovered every stolen dollar, and left his victims better positioned to build honest lives than they'd been when living his deceptions. Christine was right when she told audiences that her children would grow up knowing their father was a criminal. But they would also grow up knowing that people could choose to do the right thing even when the right thing was difficult, even when it meant giving up financial advantages, even when it meant starting over with nothing but integrity and determination. Walking away from Robert's grave for what I knew would be the final time, I understood that his greatest crime hadn't been the money he'd stolen or the lies he'd told. It had been his assumption that everyone else was as morally flexible as he was, that discovering his crimes would inevitably corrupt the people who'd trusted him. Robert had underestimated the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary moral choices when faced with impossible situations. His final manipulation had backfired completely, creating a legacy of integrity and justice instead of the greed and betrayal he'd expected. The man who'd thought he could control everything, even from beyond the grave, had learned too late that some things, love, trust, moral courage, couldn't be stolen, manipulated, or destroyed by even the most elaborate deception. Christine, Matthew, Sophie, and I had proven that sometimes the people who seem most powerless in a criminal scheme are the ones who ultimately determine how that story ends. And our ending was nothing like what Robert had planned.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.